Everybody to Sunday Morning Science. John Perry here. I'm very excited today about my guest. I have been teaching science now for since 2012, officially, publicly. Before that, I was working with professors at Oregon State University, and I would help them redesign their classes for online use. And there's a bunch of things you can do online that you can't do in a classroom, and vice versa. So that's how I kind of got started in science teaching, science communication. But 2012 was when I launched Stated Clearly. And I've done a lot of videos on chemistry, I've done a lot of videos on genetics, and most people don't have any problems with those videos, but I've done some videos on evolution. And when I started doing those videos, just the hate mail started pouring in. And early on, I figured that this really kind of deep hatred for the science of evolution and this really well-founded denial of this science was only possible because of certain religious doctrines. And I thought that there was something special about religion that caused people to be so hateful about, new ideas, right? And yeah, I figured that was special about religion. But a few years back, I did a video about an alien mummy. The thumbnail for this video is a baby alien mummy. Alien mummy. It's actually just an aborted fetus that at a really early stage, that's what fetuses look like. But there was an alien mummy that was promoted by Gaia. It was actually just a dead person that had been modified to look kind of like an alien. And I did a video explaining, this is a human, showing the anatomy, and explaining how we know that this is just a human. It's really basic anatomy stuff. And I figured that everyone would just know this right away because, you can just look at the bones in your hand and you can see the modifications they did to this mummy and so on. It's very straightforward. But that was not the case. I was a little bit rude in that video, like assuming that this was obvious. It should be obvious to people. But I got the most hate mail, the most death wishes I've ever received. And so I started to realize, wow, this isn't just about religion. There's something else going on here. There's certain ideas that people hold on to really strong, has nothing to do with religion. There's something else about human nature. That video is probably the most hated video I've ever made. It's here on the Stated Casually channel. Recently I did some videos on viruses, and I've seen the exact same thing. There's this anti-vaccine movement. There's this idea that the virus is a hoax. There's this idea that the virus is a weapon, and people are absolutely convinced by these ideas. And it is that they have a hatred towards me when I'm saying that this is either the virus is either natural or it was people who are studying viruses. It is possible that it was a lab leak. That is actually still possible. And people were just absolutely enraged by the possibility that this is not a weapon or that it's not a hoax. Whatever it is that their belief about the virus was, they refused to accept anything else. And so I've just kind of woken up to this idea that, there's something beside religion. There's something about human nature that causes this. And my guest today, Scott Perry, you might notice there's a name link between he and I, but he was trained in psychology with a focus on the science of applied behavior analysis. It's sometimes called behavioral engineering. And early on, he worked as a child psychologist for the Oregon school system. And aside from counseling, he would study the behavior of students that were causing problems in the classroom. And he'd try and figure out why they were acting out. So what were the triggers? What would happen before the student would act out? And then what would happen afterwards to try and figure out what was causing this behavior. And a lot of times, things that we think are punishments for students that are acting out are actually rewards. So if you send someone to the principal's office, for example, they might, if they're experiencing social anxiety in the classroom, well, they get to go and wait in a quiet room and then just have one-on-one time with the principal. And that might be super rewarding for them. So that might actually cause them to do this. Maybe they're scared of someone on recess. And so if you hold them in from recess, that's actually a reward, not a punishment. And so you'll get a student that's acting out because of this. Really, really interesting things that you find when you actually study. You treat a student as you actually do perform science. You're observing their behavior. And so he would produce these functional behavior assessments, and he would give advice to the teacher on how to change their behavior when interacting with the student. And also, this could be advice that's given to the parents as well. Later on, he went into school administration, and he applied these exact same techniques to, staff and organizations as a whole. And he was able to come up with different recommendations for changing school structures to help with attendance, stop students from dropping out, and so on. Change the experience for students to make it a much more healthy environment for students to come to, and a place where they would actually desire to come to. And his work has been used in several states now, changing how it is that they interact with their students and help with these dropout rates. During his career, he spent a lot of time teaching people how to do a simplified version of behavior analysis, and he's come up with a concept that he calls the ABCs of human motivation. And this has actually been really helpful for me understanding what it is that's driving the kind of the misbehavior of some of my viewers, right? And so, oh, by the way, he's also my dad. Scott Perry, welcome. Dad, welcome to Sunday Morning Science.
Thank you, John. It's a delight to be here.
Yeah. Yeah. So, kind of my first question for you is about the ABCs of human motivation, and I want to focus on certainty, this concept of certainty that you've really honed in on. But let's first just talk about all three of them together, and just a kind of a brief overview of how you've used them in your career.
Okay, sure. And this ABCs is just it's a construct that I've come up with, as we talked about, John, over the course of my career in education.
Yeah.
And I don't think what I'm saying is unique. It's not something that a lot of people haven't talked about, but I put it together in a way that makes sense to me and helps explain a lot of behavior. Not all behavior, but a lot of behavior. The ABCs, A, B, and C stand for adequacy, belonging, and certainty. And I have found that the desire for adequacy, the desire for belonging, and the desire for certainty are real big motivators of human behavior.
Yeah.
The more you think about it, the more you look at the world with those glasses on, looking for evidence of adequacy, belonging, and certainty as drivers of behavior and as motivators. The more you look at it that way, the more you see. It's amazing how many things are motivated by those three factors.
So what do you mean by adequacy, belonging, and certainty? So we're driven we're driven to feel adequate. We're driven to feel belonged. We're driven to feel certainty.
Yeah. So I believe everybody has a desire, or at least most people that I know, and me, myself included, we don't want to be inadequate. We want to be adequate. We want to be more than adequate. We want to be competent. We want to be good at things. We want to get A's on our paper. We want to think that we're a good father, a good professional, we're good at things. We're
Right.
competent. So that's adequacy, the desire to be competent, feel like you've got something of value to contribute to the world.
Right.
So that's a big motivator. The second one is belonging. We want to feel like we're part of a group, part of a family, part of a congregation, part of a club, part of a community, so that we will be missed. If we're gone, we're going to be missed.
Right.
That's the desire that we have. And then the third thing is desire for certainty. Certainty would be financial security. It would be safety. It would be predictability. I know what's going to be happening to me next week or the week beyond. I know where the food's going to come from, my shelter's going to come from. And then big life questions. Mm-hmm. I know where I came from, why I'm here, and where I'm going in life.
Yeah.
And that relates to people's religious convictions and everything else, but this desire for certainty, to know, and we live in a world that's just full of uncertainty. I mean, death, this uncertain thing that everybody faces. We live in a world that has, time and space uncertainty. When did time begin? Where does space end? I mean, there's all kinds of uncertainty. And so people are longing for a confident sense of grounded certainty, and and I think we hunger for all three of those things.
Yeah.
And I've noticed that in my work with kids, that they want to have a sense of adequacy, a sense of belonging, and a sense of certainty. And the antithesis of that, I call it a pain center, is I am inadequate, I don't belong, and I'm uncertain. Mm-hmm. And when we get evidence that those things are true, if I get evidence that I'm inadequate, I really want to do anything I can to push that away.
Yeah.
And figure out. And that's where I first noticed it with kids that had behavior problems, like on the playground. They'd get in trouble, they hit somebody, they'd do all these behaviors. And then when confronted about it, they would immediately blame everybody else. But everybody else is at fault. It's not me. And I thought, boy, this is a unique characteristic of kids that have behavior problems at school, is they blame everybody else. But then I remember real distinctly driving. One morning I was late for a meeting. It was an early morning meeting at the high school. I was driving and going through a residential area, and I was going fast.
Yeah.
And I saw blue lights in my rearview mirror.
Right.
And I realized I was being pulled over. I immediately started to try to figure out why this wasn't my fault. Why this policeman was sitting here eating donuts, waiting for a law-abiding, tax-paying citizen to come along. And, I was portraying myself as a victim in my own head.
Right.
And that's a way of protecting my own sense of adequacy.
Yeah.
If I have a choice between I'm a rotten person and the world's a rotten place to be, I'm going to choose the world's a rotten place to be, and I'm okay. It's a natural thing, protecting my sense of adequacy. Mm-hmm. Same thing with belonging. If I don't belong, that creates an enormous pain. When I first really became aware of that personally was at a wedding that I was a groomsman, which meant I stood in line at the wedding and that kind of thing. But at the reception, I knew the groom, but I didn't know anybody else, and everybody else knew each other.
Right.
So I was walking around this wedding reception, not knowing anybody except the groom, and he was really busy, so I didn't have time I couldn't talk to him. And I just didn't belong, and it's a painful thing to not belong. So,
if that's the only time you've not belonged,
no, there's many.
You've lived a wonderful life.
Belonging is a huge motivator too. Starting in elementary school and middle school. In middle school, it's more important who you sit next to than what you know or anything else. It's like the social groups, and then as we get older, we become part of different communities and groups, and you can see the power of belonging. The motivator, gangs are, it's a belonging issue. Political parties, countries, allegiance to countries. It's this desire to belong. So anyway, ABCs are big motivators, and you wanted to, I know, focus on certainty.
Well, I mean, all of these kind of overlap, right? Because you've got. So one of the things I was thinking about when you were saying we have these drives, I just think about different rituals that we have. So we have marriages, for example, which give you certainty that your partner. It gives you put a ring on, and you give each other certainty that you're there for each other. That's also a sense of belonging, and also people who are not married in a culture that puts high emphasis on marriage, they feel inadequate. So kind of all of those things are linked into these rituals. But really, I think there's a lot of certainty involved with that ritual. The religion tells you what's going to happen after you die, which gives you certainty, and I mean, gives you a belonging too. You're going to belong in some new club after you die, right?
Mm-hmm.
So anything that would challenge the belonging that you have built for yourself, the adequacy that you built for yourself, the certainty that you built for yourself is going to be jarring, right? So
Yeah.
the theory of evolution kind of attacks all three of those if you are a pastor teaching that the earth is 6,000 years old, right? So you're the community you belong to, your adequacy as a teacher in that community, and then your certainty of what it is that you are. Like all of those things are challenged if you believed and had been teaching young earth creationism your entire life. And I think, that it seems that people now are building these groups online around believing in aliens, believing in conspiracy theories, and so on. I remember during September 11th, I was actually at a friend's house. We were supposed to go hiking that day. I was in high school, and we woke up early, and we were going to go on this hike. And I was at her house. I was picking her up, and then the towers got smashed into, and so we ended up just watching TV all day with her dad. And he knew who it was. He had all these ideas about who it was and how the government was doing this and that already. He had worked out this really strong sense of adequacy that he had in his armchair about what he knew was happening, and it was just so bizarre to me. But this was a thing that he did to feel good. There's all these different groups online. Have you heard of the incel movement?
No.
Involuntarily celibate. There was a movement that started out, a very helpful, productive movement in the beginning, where people who were celibate for reasons that, because they couldn't find a mate or they had a disability or something, they would talk about it online in these chat rooms, and then it ended up turning into now it's kind of turned into a hating of women thing, where they'll show videos of murders and stuff like that, and just it's interesting psychologically what's going on there, because people have been rejected, so they don't have a belonging, and they found this second group that accepts them for being rejected, and it's turned very, very toxic. But it's really interesting to see how these things kind of play out in the world.
It's what you just said. They accept them for being rejected.
Right. Right.
I think that actually happens a lot, where people feel accepted into a group of other people that have all been rejected. I've seen that in schools with kids who have behavior challenges. They belong together,
right?
And these kids that have the whole system is up against. It's like us, we're all gonna wear our black jackets and we're gonna sit in one section of the cafeteria, and all of a sudden there's a whole new little social order amongst them,
right?
And feel adequate, and they feel a sense of belonging in that rejected group. And then they can kind of redefine what adequacy is and what belonging is within their subgroup.
Yeah. I wanted to make sure that we talk about when you were in college, kind of what, before you really developed before you were really seeing these patterns so clearly. You actually started out your career kind of as a debunker, and I didn't know this until we were talking about doing this podcast a few days ago, really. So you started out your career in college. You were critiquing a guy's research who had actually kind of fallen into this trap of certainty, and I'm curious if you can give us an overview of what that was all about, what you found with that project.
Yeah, well, when you get your master's degree, sometimes you have to do a master's thesis or a project, and I picked I can't remember how I came across it, but there was a Dr. Harold Levinson who had come up with this notion that if children have trouble reading, you can cure the reading problem, if you will, by giving them motion sickness medication. Anti-motion sickness medication will help them read more smoothly, see the letters, get the sounds, etc. And I saw his book, and it struck me as curious that we had been trained to do what they call double-blind research, where the researcher, you got two groups of subjects. One receives the treatment, the other does not receive the treatment, but the researcher doesn't know which group is which until at the very end, when the results are all tabulated, and then you reveal who is in which group, and you see if there were differences. And that avoids things like experimenter bias, and those kinds of things that can sway research. And it was curious to me that this guy didn't have any, I couldn't find any double-blind studies in backing him up. He was claiming that anti-motion sickness medication fixed reading disabilities.
Yeah. And
so
it's extra interesting because this is probably one of the easiest things to test, because you've got a pill, and so you can easily just make a fake pill that looks the same. There's a lot of things where it's hard to do double-blind studies. If you like a certain type of therapy versus a different type of therapy, those are really hard because you can't really do a double-blind, right? The patient and the doctor both know if the therapy is completely different. But this is a pill and a reading test. It should be the easiest possible thing to figure out if motion sickness medication works. And I think, like, in theory, motion sickness could work. There's no reason to say that it shouldn't. But all you have to do is test it, right?
I thought it would be a great thing if it did work, but I just wanted to test it. And so for my master's project, I found a group of students that had reading disabilities. In Astoria, Oregon. I found a pediatrician who was willing to work with me, got parent permissions, and got this group of students, divided them in half. Somebody else knew which students were in which group. I did not know. Half got a placebo pill that looked identical to the meclizine pill, which is an anti-motion sickness medication. And we put them on the medication under the doctor's supervision. I gave them a pre-test with the Woodcock-Johnson Reading Mastery Test, Form A, and then I used Form B as a post-test several months later, and then looked at the differences in reading scores and reading fluency. There was just several different reading measures that we looked at. And I essentially found that there was no difference between the two groups. And then, of course, in my study, I poked holes in my own process. I had a fairly small sample size, 14 kids total. So that was a small group, and it's difficult to get a good statistical analysis on, that's reliable and valid with that small sample size. So I suggested that larger studies be done, replicating my process. And I think other studies were done. And I didn't really follow it a lot after I finished my project because I got so involved in full-time work and family and everything else.
But I did find that other people had done fairly big double-blind studies. And
so here was a guy that, and I also have read since a couple things from him where he is really trashing double-blind studies. Trying to find ways to explain away the double-blind studies and how they're biased, and it's some real convoluted thinking. But I think here's a guy who based his career on, locked into this idea, had some experiences that the testimonials coming back, and I probably a lot of it was maybe placebo effect. I don't know. But then, once you've established your path, your sense of adequacy as a professional is based on this. You get locked into viewing the world in a certain way. And then it's really interesting how he tried to explain away what we know to be really scientifically sound processes like double-blind studies that can
Yeah.
show once and for all whether it's accurate or not.
Yeah, this is super interesting because he's got a website, he has a YouTube channel, he has a clinic. So he actually spent his entire career. He's probably getting close to retiring now, or he is retired, but his clinic is still running, and so he still treats kids for reading disabilities with motion sickness pills, and he's been doing that for 30 plus years, and he it's amazing. He has a blog on how scientists are so bad at what they do. He says that he's the only one who's figured this out. That everyone's teaching it wrong. Everyone that understands the brain wrong except for him. And just the most amazing thing is if you are a drug company and you make motion sickness pills, the one thing that a drug company likes better than creating a new drug is finding a new use for a drug that they already have been making and can get a patent on for a new use. That is the absolute best thing they can do.
Yeah.
If motion sickness pills could cure dyslexia, that would be absolutely amazing. I mean, the company that makes these pills would be paying millions of dollars to have those trials happen and get FDA approval for this new second use. So it's really spectacular that he's gone down this route and he's stuck with that his whole career. And I imagine he's probably convinced. I don't think he's just lying to people. I think he's convinced himself because of the testimonials. If you work with 100 kids, you're going to have 4 that improve during the time that you're working with them. You're going to have these testimonials. So he had, in response to the lack of double-blind studies, he published a paper with 4 case studies of students that were helped. And that's out of hundreds of people that he's treated. So it's really weird that he's fallen into this trap, and it's interesting because this is not religion based. This is not. He is a trained scientist. He should know better. He just has blinded himself to seeing this, and it kind of makes me wonder how many times I'm blinded by my desire for certainty and adequacy and so on. And we see this a lot in online debates. If someone had said something in a Facebook fight, they will oftentimes double down when they're shown that it's not correct because they've got a live audience, and so there's a belonging tug for them, there's an adequacy tug for them, and there's a certainty tug for them when they're performing on Facebook to argue something. So
it's really John, I'm glad you talked about you wonder about yourself, because I have empathy for Dr. Levinson. I have empathy for those people that are on Facebook, because I'm subject to the same desire for certainty, for belonging, and for adequacy. I recognize that those things drive me. Mm-hmm. And over the course of life, I develop paradigms that help me explain the world and help me understand and help me feel a sense of belonging and a sense of certainty within my world. And once I get those things and I start to feel comfortable and live within that skin, I start to develop blinders without even realizing it. Right. To where I don't want to see information that's contrary to my paradigm. And it takes some real effort and psychological strength and self-awareness to break down those blinders and allow new information to come in, whether it's scientific information. Or any kind of evidence that I haven't considered that would cause me to change my opinion. Right. And I think this is in relation to scientific understandings. It's in relation to political views. It's in your view of who you are in the universe, and your relationship with God, if there is a God. And if you believe there's not a God, are you open to evidence that there might be a God that comes down the road? Are you going to stay open to that? Or, I mean, it's like those blinders, they creep up on all of us all the time.
Right.
And
there's a really funny story. Man, I'm forgetting everybody's names, and I'm forgetting the names of the species too. But in paleontology, for a long time, we thought that whales were related to this. It's kind of like a wolf-like group of animals. And genetics was showing us that they were actually more closely related to things like cattle and hippos and stuff like that. And it was there were certain clues from the teeth that were suggesting that they might be related to this wolf-like species and this wolf-like group of species. And paleontologists had made museums with this in there. This is where we think the link might be. And one of the guys who had done that, he was a paleontologist. He made an exhibit and everything. He said that he found an ankle bone to one of the early things that we knew was a whale ancestor, and it had a hippo-like ankle bone. And he had just spent a bunch of money putting together this museum exhibit showing a different connection. And he said he was so angry that he didn't tell anyone for like a week that he found evidence against his own theory, and that really just debunked the connection that he had put there. Yeah, he was so angry that he wouldn't tell anyone for a week, and he's like, okay, I gotta tell everybody, and now that was this big final blow in that debunking the link there.
But when he finally did tell everybody, I just say, good for him. I mean, that takes courage and strength to be able to allow new information in. And I think that's something we ought to be celebrating when we see it, as people that are willing to change their opinion in the face of new evidence and not just hunker down, because that takes some maturity and some psychological strength to do that.
Yeah. Science is a lot of times people say that science progresses funeral by funeral, because even scientists have trouble doing this, right? So someone will gain status in a field, and then it's hard to say anything against them because you see this even in science. You see this stickiness of ideas, even bad ideas sometimes. But yeah, it is really refreshing to see someone who, like in his case, where he actually was the one who debunked his pet theory, right?
What was that again? Science progresses funeral by funeral.
Right.
I think that's great.
Yeah.
Yeah, because somebody has to die so that other people can do a modification of what they were believing and do it safely.
Yeah, and it's especially true with a new field or a field that's not well developed yet, because its personality is almost more important than anything. When all of the competing theories in a field are pretty, they're built on a fairly weak foundation of evidence, you have personality that wins out. Eventually you'll have evidence. When evidence starts to build up, personality doesn't matter anymore. But a lot of times, so in linguistics, this is a big problem right now with Chomsky. Like, if people say stuff that are against his ideas, it pretty much doesn't get published. And you will see that in other fields. Origin of life was like that for a while. That's now changed. There's a huge diversity of ideas now being studied in origin of life, but that's a big problem. The National Science Foundation found that the best way to get rid of this is to get start these really large research centers that pull in people from all the different fields of research to tackle one problem. And when you get a bunch of people together, it tends to go away. But yeah, it's a problem in science. It's a problem everywhere.
Makes sense.
We've got a couple of questions. Mike Men asks, I would love to know what your dad thought about you while you were growing up with everything he's saying. Well, that's kind of a broad, it's kind of a broad question, but yeah, how was it as a parent? As a kid, I didn't know that you were a behavioral engineer. Were you able to successfully engineer our behavior as when we were growing up?
No, no. uh, I actually taught parenting classes,
Right.
and you guys were little, and I would teach parenting classes, and then from week to week, I'd have to keep modifying what I was saying because you guys were trashing my theories. Um, I remember. Oh, there's lots of situations where I mean the behavior strategies were very helpful.
Yeah.
In working with you guys, but I also would have to say that I think we had an interesting family dynamic when you were young because we were. At that time, I was a member of the Mormon Church and very locked into the Mormon theology, which is rampant with certainty. I mean, there's certainty is. I believe that certainty is the currency of that many religions. It's a primary currency. It's like they're offering their congregation a sense of certainty.
Yeah, which is super valuable. Yeah.
Yeah, and we should talk about the value of certainty and the value of adequacy, belonging, and certainty. I think there's a great deal of value to all three of those things for us. But so while we were in this religion of certainty, I think that I was also trying to teach you guys about critical thinking and about when you see an advertisement on TV. Don't take it at face value. Ask yourself, go deep. And in all four of you boys, I really see critical thinking as a part of what you guys all do, which I really appreciate it. And
all four of us left Mormonism independently. All of your kids left Mormonism. You left Mormonism eventually. I think in a lot of part because you were teaching us to think critically when we were kids, and but I do find it interesting that you had an actual research program debunking a guy's conclusions with this very careful research while simultaneously believing that Joseph Smith got golden plates from a Native American who was resurrected from the dead. It's like the amount of partitioning that we can do in our heads, is pretty astonishing.
Yeah. I've given that one some thought because it almost backs up to the question of, can you be a critically thinking, deep thinking, research-based person and believe in God also? I mean, if you believe in the Bible and the Mormon Church, there's Joseph Smith and the golden plates and all of those things.
Right.
But the Bible, you've also got some stories that are kind of far-fetched if you think about them in terms of whether it's Noah's Ark and the flood or Jesus Christ and the resurrection. And I mean, there's a lot of things that that scientifically in our world with our senses don't match up. And so, some people reject all of those things and only trust what they can see. Some people have a religious belief in terms of, and I know you've addressed this on some of your other shows around supernatural forces and scientific forces. And one of the things I've admired about you, John, is your willingness to look at evolution and religious belief at the same time, and how they can potentially be compatible. Um, um, and I don't know where I'm going with that, but I think that was in our family. There was that kind of balance between, yeah, we've got this religion that holds these things on a grand scale, but we've also got to be doing critical thinking at the same time. And how are those things compatible? And I'm still there. I'm not a Mormon, but I do still believe in. I've got a belief in God, and I'm trying to hold to this whole notion of critical thinking and balance those. But for me, part of my critical thinking is recognizing how many things I don't yet understand about this universe.
Yeah.
And I think that leads me to my faith, while at the same time I'm wanting to gather evidence. I heard a phrase the other day that I really liked. It said, "In God we trust, everyone else bring data."
Yeah.
And I really like that idea that I trust in God, but everybody else, I need to see your data.
Well, so with Mormonism, it's especially interesting because there's a bunch of claims that Mormonism makes that are directly testable. Like the Book of Mormon claims to be a record of Native American history, but they've got swords, they've got horses and chariots, they've got all sorts of things that there is zero evidence that those things existed in Native American culture before contact with Europeans. And there's just mountains of this evidence that you can actually study it. The Mormon Church had the Mormon Church had actually tried to find archaeological evidence. They were spending a lot of money on this at one time to try and find archaeological evidence to support the idea that the Book of Mormon is an actual history, and it just led nowhere. So all of these things we could have set up the double-blind study, right? We could have figured this out, but
you can Mormon apologists who do a really amazing job at trying to justify all of those things with some pretty highfalutin language. And when people have their sense of certainty challenged,
yeah,
often go to great lengths to defend it. And that's not just with Mormonism, that's everywhere.
Well, that's like your guy who has a blog about bad science when he is the definition of a bad scientist. He's doing, he's fallen for his own bad hypothesis, and he's now saying that the world is attacking him. He's the one who knows the truth. And it's very similar when you go onto the Mormon apologetic websites. They're doing the same thing as this guy. They're taking really obvious evidence and finding ways to dismiss it that are really, really bad. Like if you're in it, it almost seems like enough to dismiss the evidence against your belief. But as soon as you just try and look at this objectively, it's super clear that they're just coming up with really desperate excuses to explain away why there's no evidence for the claim that they're claiming that they have. I think
and John, in our discussion, every time we say they, I want at least one finger pointing back to myself.
Yeah.
Because these same dynamics are going through me all the time. I don't have, it's not that I'm sitting comfortably as a judge of all these people right. that are having trouble with their adequacy, belonging, and certainty. I do too. So it's important for us to all recognize we're all in this.
Right.
All ABC ship.
Right. One of the things that we can be fairly certain of is that certainty is not real, right?
It's a myth, right?
We can be certain that certainty is a myth, right? So I think in general, the universe is just so chaotic. Our societies are so chaotic that the certainty you have in your marriage, the certainty you have in everything, like it's not fully real. And but you put this as one of our three strongest drives, And so there must be something about certainty that gives us an evolutionary advantage. If we've evolved to be so
I,
chasing after
you know,
certainty all the time, there must be something to it, right?
I thought about the evolutionary advantage of all three of those things:
Yeah.
adequacy, belonging, certainty. And it makes sense from an evolutionary point of view that we would be reinforced for striving for a sense of adequacy, striving for a sense of competence, because those who are competent are going to be more likely to survive over time.
Yeah.
So we get this drive for competence, this drive for belonging, because with belonging comes safety,
Right. Yeah.
comes increased efficiency. You know, if you're part of a group, you're able to attack a problem, a mammoth, or whatever the issue. You're able to do something as a group much more powerfully than if you do it by yourself. So there's an evolutionary advantage to that. And certainty, in an uncertain world, I believe that certainty, there's enormous power in certainty. Certainty, if you have a sense of certainty, it gives you a focus. You're able to focus. You've got specific goals that you're moving toward with confidence. If you're confident, you're attractive in this society, and that's because of people's longing for certainty. Yeah. So there's a lot of advantages to certainty. If somebody is uncertain in everything they do because they're not sure if it's accurate and they're waiting for more data to confirm it, et cetera, a lot of times they'll be frozen in inaction. Yeah. They won't move. They won't get off the dime. But if they've got certainty and that sense of confidence about the future, I know where I'm going, I know what's coming next. There's a lot of power in that. I used to love when I'd watch Muhammad Ali. I don't know if you know a lot about it.
Yeah, he's amazing.
He would always say, "I am the greatest."
Yeah.
He had this sense of absolute certainty, and he wasn't allowing. He had blinders on. He was choosing to have blinders on. He was not going to pay attention to any data that suggested that he wasn't the greatest. And that gave him a lot of power in reaching his goal.
Yeah,
so there's advantage.
Yeah, definitely in sports, having certainty that you are the winner is, that's why people in sports are so superstitious a lot of times, because that helps you gain certainty. Watching his fights, there's a really cool compilation of his knockouts on YouTube. And it's funny, he was such a good athlete that in some of the videos, this is TV in what was it, the 80s or the 70s? TV couldn't refresh fast enough to catch some of his punches. There were fights that he did where people thought that it was a fake knockout. It was like maybe he got paid off or someone got paid off to fall. And it's because he was punching so fast that you couldn't see him hit. It's amazing. He was really good and very, very, very cocky. And I think, that was a big part of, it's a big part of how he intimidated his rivals to kind of throw them off a little bit. And it was super successful. We see this in politicians as well. We see this in business leaders. So
absolutely, a politician who stands up and says, I'm not sure about this, but it's, you're not going to get the votes. It's the politician who stands up and says, I know where we're headed. I know what the future holds, and follow me.
Yeah,
we want to follow that because it gives us all a sense of certainty.
And this is one of the things that as if you're a parent and your child has dyslexia, and you meet this doctor who says that he knows, that he's the only one who knows how to cure this, and it's with this medication, and then you read a paper debunking it that says, but further research needs to be done. That's the responsibility of a good scientist, to explain what the weaknesses are of a study. But that's not what he's doing. He's saying, no, this will cure your child. And the parent is saying, oh, you're going to cure my child. There's an asymmetry when it comes to science versus conspiracy theory. And this is medicine versus alternative medicine, fake medicine. There's this asymmetry in that there's a couple of asymmetries, especially in medicine. First of all, your doctor will tell you when he can't cure you, hopefully. He or she will tell you when they can't cure you, when there's not a treatment for your disease. A pseudoscientist will say, oh, I can cure you for that. So there's an asymmetry there. The mainstream medical institute keeps track of their successes and failures. The person selling you a faulty drug isn't going to tell you all the failures that have been happening. So you don't have this accumulation of failures to look at. And then of course there's that difference in certainty. And all of this feeds into the belief in conspiracy and alternative medicines that don't actually work, and thinking that they're better than real medicines. And so there's all of these things going against the people who want to be accurate and show the uncertainty that exists. They get they get punished for being honest about this, which is, I don't know how the heck we're supposed to deal with this. This is just a huge problem. This asymmetry in being honest, really.
That's interesting. Oftentimes we're we're punished for acknowledging our lack of certainty. So we're reinforced for appearing to be certain even when we're not. And yeah, that is a problem. Celebrating uncertainty, celebrating those who are willing to acknowledge that their theory may have flaws in it, or that there may be other data that needs to be looked at. We're not in the habit of celebrating those kinds of admissions, because that's not what we're hungry for. We're hungry for a sense of certainty. And sometimes, I was thinking about conspiracy theories, and first of all, there have been conspiracies in the world, and so everything's not necessarily a false conspiracy theory.
Right.
I mean,
Right.
Sometimes there are conspiracies that happen, but as I've worked with people over the course of my life, and mostly students and schools and that kind of thing, but I noticed that there are a lot of folks who, especially folks that are in pain and dealing with their own sense of inadequacy, they are looking for something to blame that on that is not themselves.
Right.
They're trying to protect that pain center from going off. They don't want to feel a sense of inadequacy. So they're looking outside themselves, and a convenient target for that often is the government. If I'm not being successful in making a living, in providing for my family, if I'm feeling thwarted, if I have a few negative experiences with some government entities, I can start to look at the government or the church or some organization out there, especially a nameless organization, that is at fault for this.
Right.
And I can start to get anchored into that. And I think, at least for some folks, that's where the thirst for conspiracy theories and the interest in that is born out of. It's born out of this desire that something outside of me is responsible for a lot of the misery that I experience in my life.
Mm-hmm.
And partly it's because I don't want to acknowledge that my choices over time have also contributed to the misery that I'm in.
Where this gets
part of knowledge.
Yeah, where this gets really difficult is when there really is some sort of a force working against you, and you can't. The line is so blurred between what is your fault, what is something that you can change, versus what is this thing. So, my ex-girlfriend Vernia, she had narcolepsy. And she would talk about this all the time. She has narcolepsy, which makes you sleepy, and she had cataplexy as well. And it's this super vague disability in that other people can't see it. It's not like you're missing an arm, right? And it's
Hmm.
even vague to her because people get sleepy anyways, and people procrastinate. They don't, So she had this difficulty figuring out when to be hard on herself for something versus when to blame it on the disability. And then it's also a disability that's not easily treatable with medications. So that was like it was really interesting, having conversations with her about that. And we have these types of things all the time. Like if uh, if your boss doesn't like you, and that's why you think you're not getting a raise, it's really easy to think that, well, that's the only reason you're not getting a raise, or that's the only reason why you're not making it, you're advancing, is because someone or some group of people are out to get you at work, and it becomes really difficult. So,
And I really admire the struggle that you said Verania engaged in, and that
mm,
was figuring out what was her responsibility and what responsibility belonged to some other entity out there.
right.
And that's really valuable work.
Mm-hmm.
Um, uh, my wife, uh, Patty, one of the phrases that she's always asking herself, which I really appreciate, is who am I in the matter? So when there's a problem going on, she asks first, who am I in the matter? What's my contribution to this?
Right.
Uh, and there may be other factors. Maybe that the government, it may be that DMV is doing this thing to me. It may be that the bank has done this. It may be that there are other entities that have responsibility for some of this angst that I'm going through. And I have responsibility too. And I'm going to work at figuring out what's my part and what part belongs elsewhere and what can I do something about. And when I see people going through that kind of thinking, I just want to stand up and cheer, because that's the work of real integrity to me.
Yeah. 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 I mean, that is really important because it gets so easy to be bitter or to think that you're just disabled or you're oppressed, or and that there's nothing you can do about it. I mean, obviously, sometimes there is nothing you can do about it. You're actually being, in some cases, her disability was really stopping her from doing things that she wanted to do, uh, and there's just nothing she can do about it. We do not know how to treat this disease properly, but the trying to figure that out it's a real frustration for people. It's
I
hard work.
more that on the internet when people are responding to things.
Yeah.
Uh, Typically, the responses that I see from people are, "I'm right, you're wrong, you are an idiot, grow up." Whatever it is. It's like, I am completely correct in my opinion, and I'm going to attack your sense of adequacy. You are completely incorrect. And the response usually is the other person attacking my adequacy. I mean, it's this back and forth attacks on one's adequacy without a willingness to say, um, you know, I agree with this part and this part of what you're saying. I also hold this part. I mean, real conversation, real
Right.
balanced conversation often doesn't happen. It's this polarization, where people aren't assuming responsibility for themselves. They're just really looking to attack somebody else's sense of adequacy.
Yeah, and I feel like that's magnified on the internet, which is unfortunate now because we're all locked in our houses for the most part. So, like,
Mm-hmm.
because personal one on one, it doesn't happen. Like I teach evolution on the internet, and I used to do a lot of visiting in classrooms, and the experience is way different. When a student is upset with it, they'll bring up their issue, but you can they're not angry, or they're not giving you death wishes and
Mm-hmm.
telling you you're going to burn in hell. They're asking you questions, and they respect you as a human for some reason when they're talking to you in person, but not when they're talking to you on the internet. And it's interesting why that happens. And there's a certain kind of it's kind of a combination of the road rage that happens where you're locked off in your own little box, so you feel safe. You can say whatever you want, but also you're on display, and so you can't. If you back down, then your adequacy is diminished, right? Publicly diminished. So it's there's a lot of things that play there. I want to, for people who have questions specifically about uh, the adequacy, belonging, certainty, specifically about behavioral engineering, which is kind of a term that sounds almost evil, but uh, it can be used for good and evil, like
I would
anything that
prefer
works.
management, but
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, engineering sounds almost like you're.
I mean, you can do that, but you can really you can use it to change. I think behavioral engineering. I was looking up. I was looking at the history of the field, and it was originally called behavioral engineering. I think they kind of changed that because people didn't. It sounded too ominous, but uh, that is how uh, you know
I
organizations do try to engineer our behavior, um, and
when
it's for good
kids,
or for bad.
like students in middle school and high school, I found that one of the most effective ways of helping with behavior was literally to help them see the connection between their choices and their consequences.
Yeah,
Because they had blinders on. They did not want to see that connection.
yeah.
They wanted to blame everything on somebody else, when in fact their choices were resulting in a lot of the misery that they were experiencing. I'm suspended, or I'm in timeout, or whatever experience I'm having. That is a result of the choices that I made leading up to it.
Right.
But they don't see that. They see themselves as being victimized. So a lot of times, my work with them was in conversation, having them talk through, if you make this choice, what's going to happen? If you make this choice, what's going to happen? Positive choices, negative choices, what will happen? And so helping them, as opposed to figuring out ways of behaviorally manipulating them with rewards and punishments. It was really about how to engage their own thinking so that they started to recognize the connection between choices and consequences, and started making more pro-social choices that would result in them actually getting what they wanted ultimately. So there was a lot more of that than there was of kind of a behavioral manipulation, I would say. So as opposed to behavioral engineering, I think maybe the better term would be behavior management, and helping kids with cognitive processes that help them make better choices.
Yeah.
More socially acceptable choices.
Yeah. Well, when I was earlier on in my career, I was doing graphic design, and I spent a lot of time reading up on web design and how to get people to do certain. You're definitely doing behavioral engineering when you're designing a website. When you're designing a user interface, you want the person to do the thing that you want them to do, and you want to make that easy. You have this with recycling. It used to be that we would just try and make people recycle by making them feel guilty, and then the city started making the recycle box bigger than the garbage can, and there's a bunch of little things that are being done there. So I think there are when you do this analysis on a large scale, it really is, it's behavioral engineering. If you're a good behavioral engineer, right, you're trying to get people to do things that they would want to do anyways, just making it easier. But certainly, Facebook is engineering their website to keep you on there as long as possible. That's usually not good for the user. You get these addictive problems. You have there are lots of ways that this can be used against us, right? I've got a couple of questions here. How did religion evolve from caveman paintings to something that billions believe? I think religion, or believing in stories to explain how things came to be, whether or not there's evidence behind those stories, that's just been something that has always been important. We've always wanted, I think maybe I mean, you could describe it in the terms of adequacy and certainty. People have been wanting adequacy, so they tell stories, and they've been wanting certainty, so they believe stories. Uh, I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
Uh, that makes sense to me. That we find ourselves plunked down in a world where there's a lot of uncertainty. There's a lot of danger, and there's a lot of questions that we don't have answers to. We see this ball of fire in the sky. We see people be born. We see people die. We recognize that's going to happen to us. And we feel uncertain. We feel this sense of angst. And so we're looking for an answer. What can explain this? It's a hunger that people have naturally. And so if somebody stands up and says, I know the answer, it's this, and they're confident and they have charisma, well, we want to subscribe.
Right.
And that eases our anxiety, and we start to go in that direction. And then if somebody else stands up and says, no, the answer's over this way, that creates uncertainty for us. And so we want to get blinders to that because we're already comfortable with this direction. And I think that is a dynamic that happens just constantly.
Yeah. There's something else that's really interesting about mythology is that we have, it almost seems like we have to personify concepts to really start to think about them. I keep talking about this book I'm reading on the Black Plague, but everybody thought that the disease was caused by an entity. So a lot of people thought it was caused by God, but people who weren't religious would think that it was caused by a demon. They would even describe the demon. They knew what it looked like. There's a bunch of different descriptions. Some thought it was caused by this woman who wore a certain type of clothes and had a certain type of face. And there was a lady who got arrested for dressing up like that and scaring people, and she was disturbing the peace. So we have to personify, in this case, a disease to really think about it. We're so bad at it. So think of it, the Romans had gods for war. There was a god of war who would personify courage and ruthless conquering. Right? You had a god of there's gods of love. That you had different gods for these different traits, and it would help you study that virtue, right? And I think that's really interesting that we seem to have to do that. So I think that there's a lot of things involved in why humans are religious, but there is a study of this and how it is that religions.
One explanation, because God wants us to be.
Oh, yeah, yeah. I suppose that's one way you could think of it. There's the counter to that, of course, would be which god, right? Is it Zeus, or is it the god of war, or is it
mine?
Yeah,
it's mine.
So that was an interesting question there. How can the NIH engineer the behavior of Americans to wear masks? So this is actually a question that's come up several times in the comments. Sorry I didn't get to it earlier, but there's this insane division about mask wearing. Some people are so much against it, and maybe could you explain why people are so against it? I mean, is this adequacy, belonging, certainty? We don't want to over apply something to just everything because we have these three words now. But like, is there anything you're seeing here that might be driving that? I think it probably does.
Well, just to preface it, I really like that you said adequacy, belonging, and certainty doesn't. It's not the be all end all of motivators. I mean, there's a lot of things that motivate people. These are just three constructs that have been useful to me over time that help explain a lot of things, but they don't explain everything. That the general sense I get with the mask thing is some people don't want to be told what to do at all. And I don't want to be told to wear a mask in public. I don't want the government, Big Brother, and again, that's some of that I think comes from that sense of the government is responsible for my pain and my problems. Therefore, I'm kind of against authority, against the government.
Some of it comes from a genuine fear of government overreach, right? I mean,
hey, absolutely, absolutely. If they make me wear a mask now, are they going to gradually take away other rights and
right.
make me do other things over time?
And actually, that's the meme I see from my really hardcore friends on social media. It starts with masks, and then what was it? First, they're going to scare you into wearing masks so you hide your face. Then they'll scare you into taking a vaccine so they can inject a tracker in you. Then they're going to take away your guns. Then they're going to. It's people see this as the start of a cascade that's going to end in absolute domination of the public, which is interesting that people are taking it that far because it's a mask to stop you from spreading a disease, and I don't understand how the connection is being made so strongly, but it's interesting to see.
Yeah, and that's a trigger for folks who again, I believe I am adequate in and of myself, and to tell me that I need to change my behavior is to tell me that I'm inadequate in some way, and it rubs me the wrong way. It starts to get at my pain center, and so I'm going to project back out, and push against you. I don't know, people that say that if I lose that right, then I'm going to lose others, and then it's going to trip down to all my rights will be taken away. I've seen some people compare it to Nazi Germany and Hitler's view that take away people's rights incrementally. I don't know that there's a lot of evidence for that in the current situation. And I wear a mask because I might be a carrier and not know it, and I don't want to give it to anybody else. I mean, this afternoon we're going to visit our friend Joyce, who's 92 years old and has a number of underlying health conditions. And if I happen to be a carrier and don't realize it, I don't want to potentially expose her. So I'm going to wear a mask when I see her. We're going to stay far apart. She's going to stay up on her porch, stay back. And it's just, to me, it just seems like sensible precaution.
Right.
But anyway, 10 people who don't want to wear a mask might have 10 different reasons altogether. I can't really speak to all of them.
Yeah, unfortunately, I feel like it's kind of ballooned out of control to where there's so much division. It's become a there's now a political divide on the wearing of masks. Obviously, people on both sides of the political divide are wearing masks. A lot of them are, but the extreme people on the two sides, people on the extreme left are making it their personal police duty to yell at everyone they see not wearing a mask, which is kind of it's like it's reached this point of division. It's wobbling out of control to where it's now just split. And it's almost like for some of my friends that are so far on the right and against masks, they are completely gone. Like there's no more reasoning with them because they're completely severed now. So I don't think that NIH could do anything to pull those people back in. It's now part of their identity. Not wearing a mask is now part of their identity. Protesting the wearing of masks is now it's a thing they've said publicly, and they're not going to turn back on it.
Because of the and belonging. I mean,
yeah.
Maybe there are other factors too, but that's an example of it just makes so much sense that if I lock in something, I'm public about it, then my whole sense of identity, my sense of adequacy, my sense of the group I belong to, I'm locked in and my blinders go up. And so for me, the answer to so much of this angst is if individuals would assume personal responsibility and ask, who am I in the matter? What am I contributing to this? What blinders might I have up that I need to really take a solid look at? And I'm going to be asking that question all the time, while at the same time looking at other factors outside myself that I need to be paying attention to. But I think that we are psychologically lazy in relation to the work that it takes to take those blinders off, open up our sense of potential pain or pain of inadequacy, and acknowledge that we need to look at some additional data. It's hard to do.
Right.
It's hard for me to do.
Right.
I think it's hard for everybody to do.
I got a question from Ann Smith. I thought it was called behavioral modification because I was saying behavioral engineering. Yes, it's been called both, and the behavioral engineering title has kind of slipped away for sounding evil, I think.
Behavior management is the term that's used more
in schools. Yeah.
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 Systems of behavior management. It gets away from the notion that I am engineering you, I'm controlling you, I'm here manipulating you in some way. Behavior management often entails I'm enlisting you in the process. We're talking about it together. We're sitting in a circle and we're thinking through what's in your best interest, what's in my best interest, what's in the best interest of the school system, of the classroom, so that we can all get along and learn. And I engage your thinking in that. And that's a lot different than, like a Pavlovian dog. I'm going to reinforce you and give you ticket rewards for behavior.
I got a really interesting question from Helen Pinkham. Is white supremacy a belonging thing? We're seeing a lot more talk about racism, white supremacy, and so on, and then just the history of colonialism. Have you thought about this? I don't know. Have you ever listened to an actual self-declared white supremacists and seen what they're talking about?
I haven't. I've listened parenthetically. I've seen the white supremacists on the news that declared themselves white supremacists, but I haven't gone to websites and studied what they say. But it makes sense to me that any group, that the factors of that quest and thirst for belonging would be an important part for whether it has to do with white supremacy or religious affiliation or any political affiliation. It's like that sense of belonging is important. And like you say, all three of these things, certainty, adequacy, and belonging, they're all kind of intersecting. If you were to draw a Venn diagram, there would be a large intersection where they're kind of related to each other. Mm-hmm. But I think absolutely that's going on for people who subscribe to philosophy like that.
The really serious white supremacy groups, they maintain a lot of their structure in the prison system, and there it's definitely adequacy, belonging. I think one of the interesting things about the white supremacy concept is that your supremacy comes from the color of your skin that you were born with, so that would make you adequate by default, no matter how poor your choices were in your life. You could fall back on this sense of adequacy anyways. So I think that has a lot to do with it. But then in the prison system, I know several people who have been to prison, and almost all of them got into white supremacy groups when they were there, and they said that it was inevitable they had to either pretend or they had to actually this would start getting indoctrinated by these ideas because they needed to feel safe. And that's a huge problem. We something horrible is happening in our prison systems that needs to be fixed, because that's completely inappropriate. And that's what's feeding this it continues to feed it in our society too. I mean, that's one of the things. So that is a huge problem. And I think, yeah, you're right. Adequacy, adequacy, I think, is the biggest thing that I see people clinging to that idea outside of the prison system. It's no matter how much of a screw up you are, you're still adequate because of somehow something that you were born with. And then the belonging seems like a big pull for it in the prison system.
I have to say too that biases, whether it's racial bias, I think another big bias is attractiveness bias. I see that going on in schools all the time. That people that meet attractiveness criteria get all kinds of privilege that people that don't meet those criteria don't receive. Socioeconomic disadvantage. I think there's a lot of bias that all of us have, and I don't know if you've heard about the concept of the implicit bias or bias that. I mean, I've got biases. I am a white, middle class male in society. I can't even pretend to understand what it would be like to be a female in this society, to be a person of color in this society. I know what I experience, but I think part of my work is to try to figure out what are my biases and uncover them, because I got blinders on in relation to my own bias, and that's also work. That's back to that question of who am I in the matter, that I think is such a healthy question for people to hold on to.
You're talking about this attractiveness. Marilyn is, my wife. She's a nurse, and she works with people who are dying a lot of times. And she's noticed a really big bias within medicine to people who are attractive, or particularly people who smell bad. There's a bias against them. Like the nurses don't want it's unpleasant to be around them, and people can actually die because they stink or because they're ugly, or they're seen as being ugly in the medical system, because you just spend a little bit less time with them. And that adds up with every person spending a little bit less time with them, and it can be catastrophic. So she's paid extra special attention to what her when she's driven to get out of the room quicker with someone, she tries to stay longer. She's like the cute little kids that come in there. Everybody gives them so much attention, or the charming. It could be a charming old guy or a charming old woman. They get so much attention, and then the grumpy old guy or the disabled, the person that smells bad or is ugly in some way, they get neglected. It's just, we just do this. We do this automatically, and so she actively fights against that within her own self, which is it's really cool to hear her talking about this and trying to do something about it. Right? Can behavioral engineering develop actual tools to reduce the effect of the ABC biases? I mean, something like Kialo, I'm not sure what that is, KIALO, which systematizes internet debates. Oh, that's a website that tries to help with internet debates. So yeah,
moderate and get rid of some of the polarity.
Yeah,
get things reasoned.
Can we design a system that rewards? Well, you were saying earlier, we should reward uncertainty. We should celebrate uncertainty. So yeah, that's.
Where my mind immediately goes to is leadership. When we have leaders who are modeling the asking of the question, "Who am I in the matter?" They are modeling their own willingness to look at their own biases, and they're willing to look at new data. They've got a sense of kind of a humility, while at the same time a strength of direction and compassion. I've seen that in schools where you have a superintendent or a school principal who really values those kinds of traits that permeates the organization when you've got a leader who's demonstrating that kind of thing, and who is having hard conversations with people who aren't showing those kinds of traits. um, so if a society starts to value that through their leadership, then I think that we can make a dent in that. If you get really polarized in a discussion really quickly and really heated, and say you're in a staff meeting in school talking about some issues in school, if I, as your leader, I'm going to take you aside afterwards and talk to you about that, and talk to you about how I really value mutual respect and a high level of trust. Patty and I have done workshops called "Working to Stop What Stops the Work," right. And that's helping people understand the factors that are at play that shut down processes and destroy trust within an organization. And a lot of times it's when people have adequacy, belonging, and certainty issues that are running rampant, and they're hijacking processes in schools and making it unsafe for people to really have meaningful dialogue. What we found is that in organizations that have the highest level of trust, especially as exemplified by the leader, then conflict emerges even more in those organizations. But it's safe conflict, it's healthy conflict. People feel like they can express opposing points of view and do it in a respectful way and in a way that they're going to be heard, because there's an environment that is open to and willing to accept that kind of dialogue. So yeah, I think a lot of things can happen.
But you're saying one of the easiest shortcuts to this is having leaders that value it.
Having leaders who value it and model it.
Okay. In a democracy where we all want certainty, and so we want to vote for the guy or gal who declares everything with certainty, are we just in a feedback loop of stupidity here? Or are we just kind of screwed? Or is there a way out of this?
I think that we've seen leaders who have a sense of certainty, a sense of confidence, and a sense of direction, and also can show some humility, and who defer to other expertise when needed, and are open to shifting some policies and ideas in the face of data. I think that's possible even on a national scale, and I think that we've seen leadership, whether they're Democratic or Republican or independent, that can exhibit some of those kinds of characteristics, and I long for that, because I think we're in a society right now that seems to be valuing more and more extremes in terms of they're really looking at certainty over everything else. And I really hope we can get to some leaders who really exemplify this sense. Well, again, whether they are more right-leaning or more left-leaning, but who exhibit that confidence, that leadership that people can follow, that sense of certainty that we're all hungry for. But at the same time, they do so they're servant leaders, and they exhibit some humility around some of these key points, so that they're modeling for all of us how we can look at all sides of a question and not just get polarized.
Yeah, that would be nice if we could see that happen. Another question: are all alien sightings real? There have not been any objectively confirmed alien sightings that I know of. So I would say that people are seeing something when they see a UFO, but a lot of times it's normal things. And maybe one or two or several of the sightings actually are real, but nothing's been confirmed in a way that we can say that thing that person saw is a spaceship from an alien from another planet. We have not found, there's no scientific documentation of extraterrestrials that's in mainstream science for us to study. There's not even any microbes on Mars or anything that we can study for certain. There was some signs of possible signs of life that were found in the 70s on Mars, but further studies suggest that it was we were misreading the data, and they were looking at certain chemistry that was on Mars, and they thought that only life forms could generate that chemistry, and then we found out there's actually a bunch of other things that can generate that chemistry as well.
Mhm.
So our experiments were designed poorly, and Curiosity rover has some smarter experiments that it's performing. That's looking for the similar things, like can we find evidence of cellular metabolism and so on happening on Mars, but there's not been anything solid. So far as we know, we are either alone or the other life forms are just hidden from us to this point. But of
So,
course,
John, to you, how do you know all this stuff? I mean,
well,
gee.
I teach the origin of life. This is aliens is in my it's in my field here. So I've looked at a lot of
Well,
these.
as, as your father, it makes me have a certain sense of pride in you. But I just sometimes you come up with facts and information. I think, where does he get all this information
I
from?
just pretend it's a false sense of certainty I'm displaying. No,
Well,
no. So there's been a lot of
well,
investigations. I'm actually really into UFO stuff, and when I say this, people kind of think that I'm like one of those weirdos. But I'm really interested in this stuff and the different aliens that people have found, because first of all, there's no reason to think that we're alone. Like scientifically, we shouldn't, it's like a 50-50 thing as to whether or not we're alone here. There's no evidence right now. There's no good evidence that we are alone or are not alone. And so when people have these stories, you can't just discount them. But at the same time, we know that we like to personify everything. As I mentioned earlier, we personified the Black Plague. We see beings everywhere where they are not. We just have this instinct to see beings everywhere. So you just keep that in mind. People hallucinate things. People see things all the time, and combine that with the fact that rigorous science is not finding life forms, and at least the stuff that's published. And you could say,
yes,
well, maybe it's top secret, and sure, that's possible. People have kept governments have kept secrets before, but it's such a big secret that it seems really hard to keep. I would be very surprised if we've actually successfully kept a secret contact with another alien civilization, especially an intelligent civilization, let alone microbes or something. But who knows? I mean, it's certainly possible. And there are agents. There's in the news lately, people have been talking about these UFOs that people see, and there's footage of this thing that people claim is a UFO. And one of the interesting things that I find is that whenever there's an unidentified flying object, people assume it's aliens, and I don't know how a rational human being could do that, because there's lots of almost every type of aircraft is unidentified to me, except for the planes that I've flown in, right? The things that I happen to know. There's all sorts of flying objects that people are inventing and different governments are inventing. So if I see a flying object and I don't know what it is, it seems really silly for me to say, oh, it's an alien from another galaxy that's visiting us. That seems, it's fun to believe, but it's not the most rational conclusion. So there's a lot of these. There's a lot of weird things coming into play with the extraterrestrial stuff. And the thumbnail for this video is this supposedly alien fetus, and it's just a normal human fetus that's been mummified. The skull is really weird looking. It's got these different chunks of bone that come together to form this cone head skull with it almost looks like spikes coming off of it. and that's just because a baby's skull forms in little growth patches, and when it's mummified, it's dried out, so the brain has dried out, and so it's turned into a cone head, and the bone plates are overlapping each other now. It looks really strange if you look at it, and all you know about biology is what you saw on movies. You would say this is an alien, and the guy who first found it made money showing it to people, saying it was an alien. And once you know a little bit about human anatomy, especially how fetuses develop, it's super obvious that you're looking at a human fetus. But it's 6 inches tall and so on. But these are things that like we want to. It's scary looking. It's weird looking. It gives us this uncanny feeling when we look at this mummified fetus. All of those things come into play to make us draw these conclusions that are not true. It's really interesting how that works. I'm looking for highlighted questions here. We're gonna do maybe 3 more. We're already at an hour and a half. So, Tim Smith, doesn't propaganda prove how easily humans are manipulated? What would you think about that? Propaganda and marketing, doesn't that prove how easily it is to manipulate us?
I I think it does. I mean, I think that's a good point. That when I hear about the algorithms on social media sites and the algorithms that are used by advertisers, they're looking at what do people respond to, what do people buy, how can we pepper them with ads that are targeted toward their specific things that they're interested in. I think that there's a lot of effort on the part of the media to manipulate our thinking and to manipulate our purchases and those kinds of things,
Yeah.
which behooves us to be well grounded in critical thinking and taking things with a grain of salt, and in God we trust, everyone else bring data.
It's really obvious until you're being tricked by it, right? So, like, if when you watch those old beer commercials that were on TV when I was a kid, it would be some people drinking beer and then a bunch of girls in bikinis, and they're marketing towards men, and it's super obvious that this beer is not going to bring you girls and women in bikinis, but for some reason, I think it's almost a parody of itself. But there's the Axe body spray commercials, which are just hilarious, where a guy puts on his perfume and then all these girls flock to him, and that's almost, they just took it to parody level, but they're still they were still using it to manipulate people to buy their products, and it's laughable when you look at it. But then there's all the times where you don't notice it, and it really is working on you. It's working on you when Facebook promotes the person in your Facebook feed that said the thing that just drives you nuts, and you have to respond. You don't notice that Facebook is manipulating you, but that's what's happening. It's really interesting how this works. And when we were kids, I remember you showing us commercials and saying, what are the tricks that people are using on you right now in this commercial? And we would talk about them, and that was super helpful, I think. Eventually helpful for me to realize the tricks that my religion was using on me, but just every other aspect of it, that lesson was probably one of the most important things you did, like actively did, for me growing up, that I really remember. So I appreciate that.
Sure, anytime.
Can you explain the Fermi paradox? I am not. It's kind of off topic for now. The Fermi paradox would be the one where, if we actually haven't seen aliens, then that must mean that there's something really bad about developing technology, like that civilizations kill themselves. I believe that's what the Fermi paradox is. But I'd have to go read up on that again before I tried to go into that in depth. Ann Smith asks, who plays the drums?
Oh, I do.
Yeah.
This this is actually a whole studio of guitars and drums. I music is a hobby that I have.
Thoughts?
And John,
Yeah.
I don't know if everybody knows that you have an album that you did.
In high school, yeah.
Song.
Yeah.
Yeah. You need to hear John's rendition of Folsom Prison Blues, and he's also written a number of songs that I think he now disowns. But he was quite the musician in his time.
Yeah, yeah. If you Google John Perry Folsom Prison, you'll hear me at open mic night years ago. Uh, Thoughts on whether disrespect is objective? I'm not sure I totally understand that question. Does that question make sense to you?
Disrespect is objective.
Yeah.
I don't quite know what that means either.
Yeah, in that context, I'm not sure what you mean by objective. Um, I think that, well, I'm going to give you some time to respond there because there's a lag, and then you've also got to type. So, um, are there any final thoughts that you have for the people?
Well, I guess my thought is that I first of all really appreciate again kind of the honor of being on your program. Uh,
Yeah, yeah,
I'm a retired educator now, so I don't get as many opportunities to speak about these things or even think about them as I used to. I'm starting to learn to fly fish and that kind of stuff, which is a different way of getting in touch with my the inner dynamics of my psyche. But uh, I guess my parting shot would be if we all recognize that we are, as human beings, at least most of us, are very motivated by our need for a sense of adequacy and our desire to protect ourselves from messages of inadequacy. We're motivated by our desire to belong, and conversely, motivated by a desire to avoid situations where we don't belong. And we're motivated by our desire for certainty. And all of those are healthy desires. They can all be productive and lead us to fulfilled lives and successful lives, but they can also create blinders for us so that we're not allowing ourselves to see lots of other information that would be helpful in terms of our understanding of reality. So the driving question of who am I in the matter, what is influencing my thinking, and you know, what are the things that sway me? That's, I think, just really healthy to stay aware of those things.
yeah.
We could all use a little bit more humility in the way we approach the world. So there's my closing thoughts.
Cool, cool. I got a response from Max McCafel.
Okay.
Subjective or objective, meaning is it a matter of opinion? I feel disrespected, but you might not consider it disrespect. Versus the act is disrespectful to anyone as a fact. So I think he's talking about well, his original question was whether disrespect is objective. So I think I guess I would say he's asking of are certain behaviors just offensive to everyone objectively, or is there are there problems? And I would say that things are definitely, most things I would say are probably subjective, which is why if you are being offended, it's important to communicate that to other people in a way that kind of gives them benefit of the doubt at first, if you're in a situation to. Um, and otherwise, people can't immediately know if they're being offensive or disrespectful in all situations. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, one of the hard things about the internet and the way we communicate is a lot of it is not based on relationships over time. It's based on the right now with a faceless person that I've never met and I'm interacting with them. The reality is that if you and I have trust we've built with each other, John, over time,
Yeah.
if you know that I am fundamentally interested in your best interests and you're fundamentally interested in my best interests, and we can agree to disagree, but we like each other. We've had experiences where we've had some disagreements and we've gotten over them and we've built on, and we've also had a lot of positive experiences with each other. We start to build what I call a relationship bank account.
Yeah.
And if I've got a strong relationship bank account with you, I can make a withdrawal. In other words, I can have a negative interaction with you, and it's not going to bankrupt the relationship because
Right.
we got a whole lot invested in that relationship bank account. But if I have zero relationship bank account with you, and then I challenge you in some way, I challenge your sense of certainty, your sense of belonging, your sense of adequacy, you're going to immediately feel disrespected by that, and that relationship can go sour really quickly. And one of the problems is that we're interacting with people all the time that we don't have relationships with, and we're not careful about that. And so that's why those relationships sour quickly, and people see it as a disrespectful comment. Even if I didn't mean it that way, if it's a little bit in that direction, given that they have no other experience with me, that can go sour quick.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. That's a really interesting point. This big problem right now is that we have so many. Our society is so big that you interact with a lot of people for the first time ever, and then it's easy to offend somebody in a way that they think you should know better, and maybe you don't. There's, I got a question related to this, and this is gonna be the last question that we do here, just because of time. But thoughts on whether being part of more minorities makes people less biased. So, is I guess as I guess he's asking if you are, you know, if you belong to several minority groups, are you going to be able to see these biases more clearly, or are you going to be the same as someone who's not in any minority group? I don't know if that would be part of your area of
Yeah,
expertise. We're both white. We're both white guys.
yeah, it does make sense to me, though. I remember I lived in France. Was a Mormon missionary there for 2 years back when I was 19, 20 years old. And I remember somebody, when we were talking about the French language, they said they've got a phrase in France that essentially translates to if knowing only one language is like looking through the world with only one eye.
Yeah.
And knowing multiple languages gives you greater perspective, because the way people express their language, the language they use to talk about things is different in different countries. And so it gives you a deeper perspective. I would imagine that if you were if you were part of several groups that had minority status, say you were socioeconomically disadvantaged and you were a person of color or religion or some other group that was in a minority in that society, you would have a richer understanding of what people experience than, especially people of various minority groups. And if a new minority group you became aware of, you would probably have a richer immediate understanding of a number of things that they wrestle with versus somebody who was not a member of those minority groups. That makes sense to me intuitively.
Yeah. I don't know that it would automatically make you less biased. The thing that I'm thinking about is the Lutherans. So I think talking about old religions is a kind of a safer way to talk about this than current dramas that are happening. The Lutherans were they were rebelling against the Catholic Church, and there was a bunch of drama between the Catholics and the Lutherans. And then within the Lutheran movement, there was the Anabaptist movement, which was a new religion where they would rebaptize people, and a lot of the Lutherans were pretty much divided on this because a lot of them saw this as we just went through this. The Anabaptists should not be persecuted for their beliefs. And then some people went the extreme other way and they said, oh, you want to be rebaptized? I'll rebaptize you. And they started drowning people. So it's kind of like people go both ways with this. When you've been oppressed or when you've had these troubles, a lot of times you're more empathetic and more compassionate. But there are occasions where you just go the opposite way. And maybe it's I don't know what's driving that. I think in the case of the Anabaptist movement, the really violent response from the Lutherans, there was a bunch of political things involved in it as well. But it's yeah, I think there's a lot that can happen there. I don't think there's anything automatic about this.
Yeah, that makes sense. I could also see that if you are of a minority group, and you've had a certain experience, then you might want to assign that same experience to every other minority group, and that could be inaccurate. But you could be blind to the fact that you don't understand that other minority groups' experience, so that actually biases you in a way that is counterproductive.
Yeah. Cool. Well, we're going to end there because we're almost at 2 hours. So, but yeah, thank Scott Perry, Dad. Thanks for coming on the show. This is really cool.
It was my pleasure, John. Thanks for having me.
Yeah.